Thanks for joining us for another episode of No Turning Back. Today, Stan and I have a fascinating discussion with our guest, Sue Desmond-Hellman. Sue recently wrapped up a 6-year tenure as the CEO of the Gates Foundation. In that position, she sat at the center of the world's largest philanthropic effort. With today's public health crises, we tried to dive into the leadership of the public health space with Sue and learn from her experiences there. But even beyond her time at the Gates Foundation, which is a fascinating story, Sue has a leadership profile that's almost without rival. She was the chancellor of UC San Francisco, a division president at Genentech, and one of the world's foremost oncology researchers. It's a bio that just is a little bit mind-boggling, but her down-to-earth approach to leadership, the way she engages with people on her teams, builds teams, there's just a ton to learn from here. Her blend of philanthropic, academic, and pharmaceutical corporate chapters just have made her leadership career an amazing one, and she's full of essential advice for those that are trying to learn how to lead in all different sectors. Stan and I tried to tease out how she's led in so many different capacities and what common playbook she brings to each of those roles. That's one of the greatest things I think we can learn from cross-dimensional leaders, is how do you take skills from the military and apply it to the corporate space, from academia and apply it to nonprofit. And Sue is just a rich guest for diving into that transferability question. Hope you enjoy this and learn as much as we did from Sue Desmond-Hellman.
Really looking forward to the time we have together. Just by way of background, can you walk the listeners through your very, very unique history, where you are now and the multiple paths you've taken to get there?
Let me jump in on that, Sue.
Short. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because it looks to me like you can't decide what you want to be. Do you want to be a chancellor at a university or a doctor? I mean, figure it out.
I've been accused of having a short attention span, but you know, everything that's happened to me in my career has been for a good reason. And I think my career started unusual in two ways. First, I grew up the daughter of a small businessman, a pharmacist, and I was so motivated to help people like I saw my dad. But I also heard from him a lot about the business, and I thought that was really interesting. So that background led me to medical school. And as my parents like to say, they thought I'd be a real doctor. They thought I'd walk around with a stethoscope and be a real doctor. But when I graduated from medical school, I went to San Francisco to be an intern, and HIV went to San Francisco. And so the 9 years I spent at UC San Francisco as a trainee and young faculty member were so influenced by public health, by global health. In fact, they were so influenced that my husband and I, for the last 2 years we were at UCSF after our training, lived in Kampala, Uganda, and had faculty appointments at Makerere University in East Africa. In fact, I like to tell people, which is true, I was in Uganda before I ever traveled to Chicago or New York City, which is sort of strange. But, and you see a lot of people, Tony Fauci, one of those people, whose career paths have been so incredibly influenced by HIV/AIDS. I mean, imagine that you're in your late 20s or the second half of your 20s, and you're caring for people your age who are dying. When I went to Uganda, 6 months later, I went back to San Francisco, and all my patients had died. I was the oncologist caring for the cancer patients in the HIV clinic. And so this had a huge impact on how I thought about how I could contribute and what I expected of myself. So the combination of those two things is my dad is an icon for me, and this heavy influence of public health and HIV really drove a lot of the choices I made. In addition to that, like a lot of other people, my husband's an infectious disease doc, and we have a two-career family. So I'll tell you one of the funny things I tell people, and they think, oh, no, you're just saying that. My first job in the pharmaceutical industry at Bristol Myers Squibb, I was a trailing spouse. And they said, what are we going to do with this lady? We've got this very busy project, Taxol. We'll have her do drug safety. And I loved it. Loved it. I never thought I'd work in industry, never thought I'd work on anything like that. But Taxol grew to be their number 1 drug at Bristol Myers Squibb. And then my husband was the trailing spouse when we moved to Genentech, and he followed me. But I think that the working in the pharmaceutical industry and in biotechnology for me was fantastic. I got to use statistics, epidemiology, the public health things I loved, the oncology training. I had to be a cancer specialist. And I would almost surely have done that to this day if the big pharmaceutical company Roche didn't buy out Genentech. And so when Roche bought out Genentech, I had been teaching at UC San Francisco, my alma mater for my training. And people who I knew really well said, you should come back and be chancellor. And I said, oh, no, you forgot I'm not an academic. I'm not a professor. But I went back to UCSF and became a professor and had a wonderful experience for 5 years being chancellor at UCSF, in part because I kept in touch and in contact with my academic friends and collaborators. But then Bill and Melinda Gates called and said, oh, no, UC will be fine without you. We need you in Seattle. You have the perfect background, you know, drug development, you know, science, you know, oncology and infectious diseases. You spent time in Africa. And I can tell you, it is really hard to say no to Bill and Melinda, and I could not. And so I just, up until the end of this January, spent nearly 6 years as their CEO at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so there isn't a natural through line to everything I've done, but I will tell you that there is a through line for me. I love leading. I love science and medicine. And what I really love is knowing I'm part of something that improves the human condition. That makes me happy and is the basis of how I lead, to help other people understand how their efforts contribute to that.
Sue, that is amazing. And of course, you use the word that perks our ears up so much, leading. Because a lot of people think that they build up a certain expertise and confidence in a certain sector, a certain sort of cultural world, and then they think that they can't step out of that and lead in another world because they won't be credible or ready. I'm going to ask you to do 2 things, if you would. Compare the leadership environments in business and in academia and in the nonprofit world, and then also sort of broadly in the public health world, because I think we're learning that public health is probably 70% leadership and 30% science. But compare those and then talk about the value of having expertise or experience in all of those.
Well, one of the things that I think is an asset in business, which I actually really liked. So for 16 years, I was in the for-profit business world. What I like about business is I'm a rule follower. You know, I would say I'm a Catholic school kid. You give me a commandment, I'll follow it. You know, and what I liked about business, especially in a public company, is you talk to your shareholders, you talk to Wall Street, and you say, okay, here's earnings per share. Here are the top 5 goals we're going to go after this year. Here's what we're committed to as a company. And then you can be measured by that. With your staff, one of the things we did at Genentech that I really liked is every year we put corporate goals together. They were bonusable corporate goals. And so if you're a staff member, you know what's expected of you, and you have money comes or stock options or something that is tangible and valuable. I liked how objective that was. I liked measurement. I'm a numeric person, so I think that business leadership gives you those tools so that as a leader, you can push yourself to say, okay, we've got our mission and our values. Have we aligned then our goals and those tools with our mission and values? Because then staff members have a line of sight to say, okay, here's the kind of company we want to be. Here's what we need to achieve to do that. When I first went back to the not-for-profit world in a university, I found it really hard. I missed those tools. Like I really missed. I actually started up something that my successor still does, which is an annual address called the State of the University. And the State of the University was in some ways me just saying, I need something here. Mm-hmm. You need to talk not just about the incredible goals and the incredible ambitions we had of values and mission, because a public university in California has assets galore on mission and values. But I wanted some tangible goals. I wanted to be personally held accountable and to hold other people accountable. And I would say that the same was true when I went to Gates Foundation, that a not-for-profit, I think it's easy as a leader to over-rely on your mission and to fail to put out tangible goals, because I just think that's a really important part of it. And I feel like I benefited. I had to get rid of some things that I did in business, especially when I went to the university. I had this thing, tenure, that I had to get used to. And some of the faculty members thought I was, like from Mars. So I definitely had to make sure I understood the rule set and what went on. But one of the things I really valued was that ability to push myself to say, does everything line up? Does a human being who comes to work for this organization know what's expected of them? That, from a leadership standpoint, that's always been an essential thing for me.
Can you talk about how that was accepted in those different spaces, in academia and the nonprofit world? It must have taken a little bit of coaching, a little bit of give and take. Well, how did you get people on board for that?
Well, at UC San Francisco, I think I'll give you the negative and the positive. The negative is I took that job in 2009. So times were really tough. There wasn't enough money. And I made a lot of mistakes sort of pushing hard to re-engineer some of our expenses and some of our administrative costs. And that had an impact on the faculty, and they did not like it. I adjusted, and the adjustment that was so important was to recognize that everybody's a human being. Even if times are tough and you don't have enough money, the question that I got right was, okay, we need to be more efficient. What I needed to adjust was, what's in it for me? How is Sue going to help me achieve my goals? And one of my goals when I went to academia was to get good at fundraising, to learn how to do that and to get good at that and partner with faculty to make sure that if the state of California couldn't give us funds, that I would help them get funds. And it turned out that was incredibly successful. And so a professor would see me not just as a money saver, that's not exciting. That sounds like takes away, right? But as somebody who would sell their program. I'll give you an example of when this hit me. So I was like, oh my gosh, of course this is true. I was on a local radio show on NPR, and they have a great science and technology program. So I was being interviewed by this terrific radio interviewer. And I just started rattling off all the things I loved about UC San Francisco, all the different things in the faculty and the science they were doing and the medicine and the teaching enterprise. And I said, I didn't even, before I got here, I didn't know much about the dental school. There's amazing science in the mouth, like all these things we can learn. Well, the faculty were absolutely delighted. If I had been smart enough, I said, do that. They had no idea how much I was learning about them. And I had no idea how much that was a demonstration of respect and affection. And so I think that both in terms of tangible things like money, but also things like, do you give my program in academia, do you give me respect? Do you give me some publicity? Do you come and visit my lab? Do you participate in things that I care about? At Gates Foundation, it was really, and I'm still a senior advisor at Gates Foundation, so I still interact with folks at the foundation. There's a lot of former pharma and biotech people there. So there's sort of like, there's people who were really happy that I understand their world. And then there's a whole group that does education. And so because I was chancellor, especially for higher ed, they know I understand their world. The biggest challenge is how you set goals, and working like with the WHO and the global health enterprise. For me, that always feels very fuzzy. And where I think I do well is where I interact with people and really learn from them, especially on the policy side and how you get things done. Where I don't do well is where I get frustrated, like, what do you mean it could take 5 years? That kind of thing. The sense of 193 or 194 nations coming to a consensus feels like quicksand to me. So like a lot of former business people, I have to take a deep breath and not get visibly frustrated, because the United Nations and the WHO have a really important purpose in the world. So enhancing their effectiveness rather than complaining about them is the right thing to do.
Just one quick follow-up to that point in your opening comments, and then I'll give the reins back to Stan, I promise. But you said I love leading, and you just ran through sort of a master's class and some of the things that a leader of a senior organization has to constantly keep on their plate, touching base with people, understanding their position in the org and their view on things. When did you make that pivot? When did you realize I actually love leading teams and organizations?
It was sort of gradual and then fast. I mentioned when I was at Bristol Myers Squibb that I worked on the Taxol team. And there was about a dozen clinical research associates who were on that team. So after I'd been there for a few months, they asked me to lead that small group of clinical research associates. And I realized that to a person, each one of them knew more about drug development than I did, which was shocking, but true. And so that was just such a safe way to learn to lead. With a product that was just succeeding by leaps and bounds. And so it was hard work, but it was successful work. So that's a great way to have your first experience. Then when I went to Genentech, a year into my tenure, the head of the medical group left. And the CEO, Art Levinson, suggested that I become a vice president and lead all of the medical group. And I still remember this. I love this story. I called my dad and I said, I think Art Levinson's like really done something crazy. I don't even know what a vice president is. He should not make me a vice president. And my dad said, you really think that guy's a smart guy? You ought to just ask yourself, maybe he's right and you're wrong. And I thought, well, if my dad thinks so, that's so I literally went on the executive committee at Genentech, started attending the board of directors, started doing investor relations, and so I needed to start thinking like an executive in a publicly traded company. And I will say the more of the leadership things, I did two things that I would point out to try and help succeed in what felt too fast to me. The first thing that I did is I talked to the CFO and I said, can your team give me a class? Can you give me a class on earnings per share and NPV and all this? Because I have no idea. Like, I did not go to business school. I don't know what any of this is. And I feel like I need to learn this. And Lou Levine, the CFO, and his team not only gave me a class, but just like I experienced at UCSF, they were delighted I cared about their stuff. So I became really good friends with the whole finance team, and I would laugh with them about how stupid I was until they trained me. So I did that. And then the second thing I did is I don't really like a lot of business books. I feel like business books should be an HBR article, and then they make them to a book to charge more money. I mean, I think most of them are really dull. So I started reading biographies. And I will say that I to this day, I love biographies. I'm reading Robert Moses' biography right now from Caro, and I just read the 4 volumes of Lyndon Johnson, which is a commitment to a biography. But there's a pandemic. But when I read the biography for the first time of Lincoln and saw how messy it was during the Civil War and how he went through all these generals and everything, I thought, okay, I can do this. Even Lincoln made all sorts of mistakes. And I really, to this day, enjoy biography more than business books in terms of leadership learning. I just think it always makes you think about, I mean, the book I'm reading now is just so interesting because I've often asked myself, how pushy do you have to be? I mean, it's something people always worry about me, and especially when I was younger, but this evolved. Was I too soft? Was I too sweet? Did I need to be more aggressive or pushy? I would say that I don't worry about that much now. I'm plenty pushy. But a couple of colleagues who I've worked with, they just say, you're blonde, you're female, you smile a lot. There's nothing sweet about you. But I do think biography really gets you that when is it time to be relentless? And when is it time to back off? I think that's the art of leadership, is that balance is so important.
Yeah. Boy, you've given me a lot to work with here, Sue. We've got a lot in common. We both listen to our fathers a lot, but also people accuse me of being sweet all the time, and I'm trying to dodge that. But, interestingly enough, I was about 50 years old, and I think I was a major general at the time. I'd been in the Army about 30 years. We were at war. Chris and I were at war at the time, and I got a chance to visit my father, and my father was a retired soldier. And he says, you should get out of the Army and go to law school. And I said, Dad, I'm kind of committed, on this thing. And he goes, it will teach you a disciplined way of thinking. And where I'm going with this, Sue, is you're a physician and a clinical researcher. And I associate that with developing a rigor of how you think and how you approach problems and how that might impact how you do a whole range of leadership tasks. Can you tell me if I'm off base or how that affects you?
Oh, I think you are right on track. That I think there's a sense of being data driven. There's a sense of responsibility. I also think, particularly as an oncologist, there's 2 aspects of being an oncologist that I to this day push how I behave. One is just, and I think you must see this in spades in the military, having a seriousness of purpose. The worst day in most people's life is when someone says you have cancer. It's a terrible day. And so the obligation that you have as a physician to comfort, to be honest and open, but not too much at once, that's a dicey moment. That seriousness of purpose. It doesn't mean you have to be gloomy. It doesn't mean, that you've got to be negative, but just serious. It's a big responsibility. And the other is just bedside manner. Yeah. There's one of the things that I think is hardest about management is giving performance feedback. it's hard. It's really, nobody wants to hear something bad. I mean, giving good performance feedback is easy. To do that all day long. And I always think that sense of bedside manner of like, okay, I'm going to give a little dose of this. Like there's something, you know, I often say to people, like, I have to tell you something hard and I'm really uncomfortable tell you something hard because I respect you so much and I appreciate you so much. But when I ask for feedback about you, here's what came back. And I want you and I to talk about this. Because I know what you're going to feel. You're going to feel like I just stab you through the heart because you're a perfectionist. And I just think one of the things I really feel good about in leading people is trying to see that they're capable of more than they thought they were capable of. And part of that is feedback, and part of that is working on things. But I do feel so often like the conversations are a lot like bedside manner, like talking to a family, talking to a patient. And so that kind of data-driven, for me, it's sort of like data-driven, but with a heart. Yeah. The two are really similar that way.
Boy, that's fascinating. Before we go on a little tangential thing, your next Robert Caro book should be a book he wrote called Working. And he writes about how he writes books. And it's fascinating, you know.
Is it good?
It really is amazing. And here's a guy who spent 10 years writing each volume of the LBJ book. So, I mean, he gets into it. But I wanted to...
It's incredible, that guy. That guy is making me stronger just lifting his books.
But you probably have read a biography of General Ulysses Grant. And if you haven't, I'm sure you've heard this, is as the war progressed, he would not visit hospitals of the wounded from his campaigns. And he didn't do it because it just took so much emotional strength out of him that he found he couldn't make the tough decisions going forward in battle that he had to do to end the war. So I really want to come back around to you talk about a person's worst day as the day they hear about they've got cancer and the bedside manner. And having done just a very small amount, of course, visiting our wounded, that's emotionally draining. How do you as a physician take care of yourself through what is a constant taxing process of dealing with people's tragedies?
Yeah, so one of the things that I did when I was in school was I started running every morning with my sister Judy, who's a year younger than me. And we were both extremely conscientious students. And somehow getting up and running and knowing your sister was there at 6:30 in the morning and would knock you out of bed if you didn't became a habit. So to this day, I run every morning. And I definitely find that exercise during the toughest times that I would have in the hospital, exercise was a big part of how I managed, a really big part. And so beginning my day with a run that got me ready to go in the hospital, go on rounds, do all of that. And then ending my day, my husband and I have this thing like TV's off, just the two of us, have a nice dinner and relax. So I would say those sort of habits that, you know, no matter what the day is like, to be able to count on that. And if either of us is traveling, because he does global health as well, if either of us is traveling, we get on our device, and now everybody's Zooming, but we Zoomed before it was Zoom. So that's just, I mean, I think family. The other thing I've always liked, although I'm still getting caught up on the bubble and everything else, I'm a big sports fan. And so I just think that it's I don't watch a lot of TV, but if I do, you know, watch football or watch basketball or do something like that. And I think what that does for me is it just turns off my brain, you know.
Well, I think it's important.
It is, yeah.
Sue, can I pivot us up to sort of today's state of affairs, specifically in the healthcare arena? When I was a younger officer in the SEAL teams, then General McChrystal, when he first taken over the counterterrorism units that I was part of, would, much like yourself, circulate the battlefield down to the team level, get perspective, and was well known for asking a very interesting series of questions of newer leaders, saying, how are things going? Things are going great, sir. What you doing? Working on? Nothing. Everything's fine, sir. And then he would pivot and say, okay, if I told you you and your unit couldn't go home until we won this war, what would you do differently? And then, of course, everyone would open up and say, oh, well, there's 10 things we did wrong yesterday. And here, and you'd get deep into what had to change about the system. So if you had, all the leaders of the world get together and say, okay, there's no more healthcare around the world, and they hand you a blank whiteboard and a pen and say, how do we redesign it? Where does your mind go? What are the big things we're getting wrong?
Well, I would start with a philosophy, and the philosophy is that healthcare is a right and not a privilege. I think COVID sort of reteaches us what we see in other countries. Families shouldn't think they'll go bankrupt because someone's sick. People shouldn't go without their insulin because they can't afford it. That should never happen. So I think that's once you have that philosophy, everything changes. And so then other things follow. And one of the things that needs to follow, I'm a big fan of, and I think we see in COVID how important it is. Prevention is so much better than treatment. Not everything's preventable. Plenty of Americans have things that we don't know how to prevent. But many Americans and many globally have problems that are totally preventable. So I think, especially once you decide that healthcare is a right, then it's also an obligation to do your best to stay healthy. And so tying that with education is such a positive thing, because I just talked about starting running when I was in high school, and today I'm running. So, those are the kinds of habits and things that kids can learn that are actually fun. And if you think of that as fun and interesting, so I think we need to sort of flip upside down a very disease-oriented to a wellness-oriented. And I actually think Americans are interested in that. Young people are interested in that. And coming out of the coronavirus pandemic, I think is a great opportunity for us to say, what do we want the health of America to be like? How do we want to feel? How do we want to interact? It won't prevent things from happening in the future, but it'll put us in a better place when they do.
But that's remarkably powerful, Sue. I mean, if we just sort of bottled what you just described and could get people to drink of it, and like you say, I think a tremendous number of people just want to do that now. But then there's a lot of people, particularly the ones Chris and I deal with in healthcare, we'll talk to them and we'll say, the system's got problems, right? And they'll go, oh, it's broken. And you say, well, we need to change it. And they'll go, you're right. And they'll say, well, what are you going to do? And they say, well, don't know where to start. Kind of a problem. So as a leader, when you go into an organization and that organization, for some reason or another, is unwilling or unable to start to really move in the direction they probably know they ought to go, how do you get them to do that?
For me, it's always like, where's the destination? Once you know the destination, people get excited. They want to be part of that. So I think the destination, and then what's my role? What's my part of it? I used to love to do product development. I'll give you an example. When we developed the medicine Herceptin for breast cancer, there's a very new medicine, very different. And we knew that 25% of women who had no good treatment for this most scary form of breast cancer would benefit from it. We put a date on the calendar. Everybody knew what they were doing, and they knew in their mind who they were serving. What was the objective? What was the outcome we were trying to? I can't tell you, like to this day, I remember the day that Herceptin was approved. And Al Gore gave a speech the next morning. It was really fun. And we were literally, the volunteers in the company helped put the boxes on the vials so we could put it on the FedEx truck and send it out. And we were exhausted and thrilled. But the breaking down healthcare into pieces that look like that, what does it look like? Fewer diabetics, fewer people with heart disease, more people healthy, less hospital admissions. Those kinds of things are as exhilarating as, solving a cancer problem. But I think that the leadership part is break it down into the outcomes you want, and that everybody knows what their role is in that outcome.
Can we talk a little bit about how you see leadership in the healthcare space at the individual level? I grew up in a medical family, mother, father, both sets of grandparents, et cetera. My dad was an officer in the Army for a few years after medical school, and then went into practice. And when I went into the service, we had early discussions around this, and his observation was, you're going to learn a certain type of leadership in the military because you're in charge of 4 people and 8 people, et cetera, and you're expected to be able to lead at these different levels. In healthcare, and he said, I sort of missed that, because in healthcare, you're judged only on your competency as a physician, and that's, you get credibility, and you can lead others based on your skills that you develop very early on in your career. It seems like there's a change taking place there, but what you're describing, I think, requires a different view on both the competency and how you interact with your patients and your knowledge and your ability to lead others. Do you think that's a trend that is going to pick up momentum, especially after the last year?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the operative word is system. When often people don't feel like they're part of something that either has care or system in the vocabulary. And so that's where, and there are those institutions, there are those organizations like Kaiser. Kaiser is a healthcare system in this area that's really starting to change. And everyone has their role in that system. They may be a leader, they may be executing a part of that system. So I think what I would love to see, and many people who are public health experts are pushing ourselves to say the American healthcare system has to move much more to a public health system, much more oriented to public health, much more oriented to prevention. And if you're a caregiver, whether you're a physician, a nurse practitioner, a nurse, what's your role in that system? How do you participate in that? And how is the community involved in that? One of the neat things that I've seen is some very successful community efforts to do COVID testing, very much customized to who's the population involved and why should that population trust you. So those are the kinds of things that are much more public health oriented, much less oriented to, you go into an emergency room, you got a broken leg, somebody fixes it. That'll still have to happen, but that's not a system, that's an emergency.
Sue, I'm going to conclude this first by thanking you for a wonderful session and your generous time, but with a question about the future, because we've been leaning that way. And it's young women and men who want to take a path somewhat similar to yours. They want to make a difference, maybe in public health, maybe in business that does this, but not all of them get lucky with their bosses or get lucky with breaks. How do you think about mentorship? How do you, as Colin Powell said, how do you put down the ladder to help other people up the way you came? What's your thinking on it?
Well, first, for the people who are in that position, the thing that I would strongly encourage is 2 things that really helped me. One is every chance I got, I kept learning. When I was at the end of my oncology fellowship, the second year I went back and got a master's degree at Berkeley in epidemiology and biostatistics. Just That was a great thing to do. I had a little extra time, nights and weekends. But keep learning. It doesn't even have to be a degree. Just you will do well, especially analytics. That's the wave of the future. So keep learning. And the second thing is, mentorship for me is a really important thing. It is getting involved in things where you can contribute and you can learn. And so it might not even look like a formal mentorship, but look at I used to tell people, look around the room when you're sitting around a table and look at the person who you say, oh, I'm so glad they're here. It's going to be fun, inspiring, and will make something happen. Then be that kind of person. Look at people who you respect, who contribute, and copy them. I mean, there's no foul, there's no rule against. I just think that copying people is underrated. And seeing somebody who's leading or who's contributing and making a difference and saying, I want to be just like them. Next time somebody says, like, you go, how can I help? What can I do? Say the things that you see people say who are inspiring and helpful. That is step one for me on mentorship is who's making a difference? Be like them.
Well, you convinced me this afternoon, Sue. I'm not going to go to law school. I'm going to go to medical school.
Go for it.
Last about 2 weeks. Let me just thank you for all you've done first, because you couldn't be more right about the need to rethink healthcare in America. But you didn't just say it; you've been doing it for a lifetime, and you are also an example to other leaders to make the rest of us want to make a bit of a difference ourselves. So, for all the people you inspire with this podcast, as you've inspired Chris and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed talking to you guys.
No, it's been a pleasure. And, Stan and I teach a leadership seminar together. And we'll tell students all the time, when you encounter leaders, you'll see a through line that they always, as they get more senior, there's always these easier off ramps. Because they can always find a less stressful way to live at a certain point, and they consistently will make the other choice, right? Leadership is a choice that people make because they believe in the mission and they believe in helping others. And this has been a great example of that. So thank you for the time today.
Absolutely. Thanks, you guys.